with me. Okay, so today's session is all about composting, and quite literally, what is composting? Someone described it to me as muck and magic, and I thought to myself, you know, that's pretty close to the mark, if not slightly off-putting in the wording that they've used. But what is it? Composting is the process where naturally occurring microorganisms and bacteria, now that's stuff that is in the soil and in our environment, it's tiny, we don't see it, we don't even give it any thought, it's just there and we accept it. So please just accept that that is happening. And that basically is part of the magic part of it. These wee guys are doing a whole load of work that we are oblivious to. But anyway, these wee beasties and bacteria are converting coarser plant material, such as the common things that I would put into my own compost heap are grass clippings, shrub prunings, and this time of the year in particular, leaves. But you know, your evergreen leaves are constantly dropping leaves all year round, so there is always a little steady supply of leaves to add to a compost heap year round. And of course, along with your garden waste, you've got your kitchen food waste, and that all gets muddled in together. The microorganisms and bacteria do some magic breaking down, and it is eventually over a period of time converted into a soil-like material, which most of us would recognise as being that kind of bag compost, like a general purpose bag of compost that we buy out the garden centre. That's probably the closest feeling sort of medium or material I would compare it to. And this new compost that we've made, this garden compost, has several uses in the garden space. We can use it as a feed supplement for existing soil surfaces and our borders. We can improve our soil structure. So if you've got really cloggy clay soil, that would help improve the structure of your clay soil or sandy soil, and as a top dressing or a mulch, which can help reduce the amount of weeds that will germinate and grow there. So it isn't a complicated procedure. I think Jenny thinks it's quite complicated, but she's going to be blown away and she's going to be doing it herself by the end of the weekend without any doubt whatsoever. It's not complicated, it's just understanding it, and I'm sure by the end of this I'm hopeful that you all will also. So not complicated at all, and making your own compost is, to me, a win-win situation. If you read gardening articles, you'll quite often see that they refer to use garden compost, using your own homemade compost. So these garden journals refer to it frequently, and they consider it the norm, and clearly it's respected material to be using. So at the end of the composting process, you've produced this prized garden resource, whilst also reducing the quantity of kitchen and garden waste that would ordinarily be getting put into our recycling bins and sent off to, well, hopefully some of it would be recycled, but sadly a lot of it still is going to landfill. So I mentioned the bag compost. Lots of people get confused between the bag compost out of the garden centre and our own homemade potting compost. So I'll just run through a few points to differentiate between them. Garden compost is made using natural materials that once had a life. That's how I think about it. So the grass that was growing has now been cut, and the clippings that are gathered in the basket are now put onto the compost heap. So it was once a living material. Kitchen vegetables, you know, like your potatoes, they once were living, they were growing, they've now been harvested, they've now been peeled, we've eaten the tatty part that we want to, and the peelings have now gone into the compost heap. And even things like newspaper and cardboard, if you think about it, that was once a tree, and we've now read the newspaper, it's had its use, it was a living thing at one time, and now it has been put into the compost heap and it's become part of that composting activity. Garden compost can be as organic as you choose to be. If you garden organically, then everything that you're putting into your compost heap is organic, and likewise with your food waste. If everything that you buy to eat is organic, then likewise all the waste or the scraps that you put out will be organic also. And to all extents and purposes, garden compost is free. You've already paid for the newspaper, you've already paid for the potatoes that you're eating, you've already paid for, I don't know, all the bits and bobs that are going into it. They don't actually have a cost. The cost comes in your time and effort in putting that in, but that's not really a cost. Compare that to a bag of shop bought potting compost. Now, I put this at the very top here. It's a good replacement if you can't make your own garden compost. I am not knocking potting compost. It is very good. Garden compost is just better. So if you can't get garden compost, by all means go out and buy your potting compost, because it is good also. But potting compost is commercially made using a variety of different ingredients, which can include peat, coir, coconut husks, you know, different bits and bobs that have came from all over the world. And they sometimes include a proportion of loam, which is a section of topsoil, basically a mix of sand, silt and clay. Excuse me. Some bagged commercially produced fertilizers, and that is like plant food, and that is added as an additive, and all of the above costs money. And if you're only buying one bag, then it's not out of the way, but it can be very costly if you're using growing, or vegetables for that matter. Most of you will be familiar with plants called rhododendrons and azaleas. They're the ones that here in Scotland tend to do very well, and we get lovely spring flowers from them. But this particular group of plants, they prefer an acidic soil. And you can get a special compost, a bag compost called ericaceous compost, that these types of plants, the rhododendrons and azaleas, prefer to grow in. So that is a plus side of having the potting compost. You also get your general purpose compost, and composts that lend themselves to growing annual plants that have got higher proportions of plant food in them, because your annual plants, your bedding plants, live a fast and furious life, and they need lots of food sort of flung at them really quickly. So a particular bag of compost for them would address all their needs, compared to our homemade garden compost that is a bit more run-of-the-mill, sort of middle of the road, neutral pH, and sort of like addresses most of the needs of all your plants, but it won't sort of like nip specialities exactly where they need them. So garden compost is pretty much middle of the road. So what are the benefits of using garden compost other than saving a wee bit of money? So garden compost benefits include improving your soil texture, and that is the texture of your soil is how clayish or how sandy-like a soil is. If you've got very sandy soil, it doesn't hold on to nutrients or hold on to water. So mixing in some homemade garden compost will increase the quality of that sandy-like soil. Soil structure is all about how the soil actually holds on to water. You want it to hold on to water enough that the plant's roots can get a drink of water, but you don't want the structure so boggy that it's actually holding on to too much water and the roots are rotting, sitting in water. So again, garden compost can improve soil structure. Garden compost also contains humus, and you know, like naturally occurring rich humus-rich soils will appear in natural spaces that haven't been farmed or over-gardened, and woodland floors are a good example of humus-rich soils. And humus is a natural organic material that appears in the soil, and it's made up of dead plant and animal materials in the world. I'm sure in your compost heap you will not be adding dead animals, and it decays down over time. So humus is a fabulous natural occurring material, and it is great for holding on to water and holding on to nutrients, and has a huge proportion of natural nutrients in itself. So it's a very natural worthy product to introduce into your garden soil. Garden compost also warms up quicker in the springtime following our dreich Scottish winter. Attracts and encourages earthworms and other beneficial organisms to work and maintain a healthy garden soil. And we've got to remember that healthy soil is a valuable commodity. Here on Earth, we've only got so much space. We can't make any more ground. We can build more houses, but we can't make any more garden space. We can't make any more ground to grow things on. So soil is a valuable commodity, and a healthy soil is even more so. I've been actually doing a wee bit of boring Jenny with this, talking about earthworms the other day, but I found out a little statistic that I'm going to share with you. 5% of a very healthy soil will be made up of channels made by worms burrowing, which allow air to penetrate and helps drain the soil. So I've said compost helps with the structure and texture of the soil, but compost also attracts and encourages earthworms to stay in the soil, and they themselves are really beneficial to helping maintain a healthy soil. Garden compost can be added to any soil type. It doesn't have anything specific in it, so it's not going to harm a particular type. And if you do have a specific plant type, like your rhododendrons or your azaleas, acers, blueberries, then you can add in specific plant requirements as they need them. You can use the product confidently because you know the origin of all the ingredients. If you've added everything to the compost heap, you know where they've came from. And of course, all these ingredients are free and they've been generated by your own home gardening activity. And of course, all of this ultimately benefit the continuing healthy growth and productivity of flowers and fruits in your garden. So, any drawbacks? Time is probably the biggest drawback compared to buying a bag of ready to use. You know, just go to the garden centre, bring it home, cut it open, Bob's your uncle, you can start using the compost. To get to the stage of using our own homemade garden compost, it will take a minimum of 6 months, but it's good fun in the meantime, getting to that stage. Minimum of 6 months, and depending on the temperature and things like that. We get to that in a wee minute. We'll talk about that in a second, but a minimum of 6 months. So don't think you're going to go out and make compost this weekend and you'll be using it next week. You're going to have to buy a couple of bags of potting compost between now and then. But of course, there's always a flip side. So on the plus side, once the process has started, making the compost at home, it's an ongoing activity. So you're generating fresh garden compost all year round. So now that we appreciate the benefits to our garden, what benefits are there in using composting as an activity to support or engage our clients? Firstly, composting can be a year-round project, generating activity from collecting materials from the kitchen under the garden, shredding materials if required, like the picture here shows a kitchen roll insert being shredded up the cardboard, and then there's some deadheading material that's been brought into the tabletop with some scissors, and that can be snipped up into sort of like finger-sized pieces. And of course, mixing the materials all together is a great activity that many people could get involved in. Depending on the individual, the outcomes and benefits can include physical benefits, light exercise, which is linked to stress reduction, maintaining a healthy level of movement, fine motor skills in the cutting and the shredding of the compost materials. And if you're making a big compost heap and you've got somebody with lots of energy or younger people that need to develop their gross motor skills, a wheelbarrow full of composting materials is a great way of developing those skills. Cognitive skills can be addressed through things like the sustained attention of the ongoing activity, and logic and reasoning in the selection of the materials. It's very sensorial, especially if you are allowed to handle the different materials, all those different textures and smells when you're actually handling plant foliage, just the different textures. And it's not until you actually cut up bits and bobs and bring them in and start handling them, you realise how many different surfaces and textures, soft things, hard things, crunchy things, jaggy things, they're all there. And emotional, the satisfaction of contributing to a worthwhile task, the accomplishment in completing the task, and of course, if done in a group setting, the social inclusion. So, now we think we know that we want to have a go at making this garden compost. How do we actually go about doing it? So, first of all, we need some stuff to get started. First point is to consider the space available and which type of compost bin or compost heap you can accommodate in the space. First picture in the top left hand side here is actually my friend's compost heap. Her husband made it out of wooden slats, and it's in a very sunny part of her garden, but it's miles away from her kitchen door, so it's a bit of a trek for her to get there, but she sited it in the best place in her garden because heat is very important for the compost to start to cook. So a traditional wooden compost heap constructed out of wooden pallets will take up a lot of space, but if you've got a big garden, it's amazing how quickly you will start to fill up that area. The second one down, the picture on the right hand side, is a proprietary compost bin. They're usually made from a plastic of some sort. They're easily sourced. Some councils actually give them out for free. They're much smaller than a sort of like homemade wooden pallet type compost heap. Therefore, they require less space, and you know they're fully enclosed, so they're maybe less messy on the eye for some folks. And those are two quite big ones. Later on, I'm going to show you the Windowsill compost bottle that I made earlier, but you can use large plant pots or pails, and as I say here, this 2-litre recycled juice bottle can actually be used as a composting container if you fancy trying that one out. I've said keep the bin or the heap in a sunny spot, so you're going to site it where it's not subject to extremes of temperatures and moistures. So that means for us in Scotland, I don't think we'll ever have extreme heat, or if we do, we'll not be worried about our compost heap when it came to that stage, but the sunnier the better. And somewhere where it's not going to get a deluge of rain. It does need to be kept damp, but mine's is semi-sheltered, so it's not getting loads of rainfall falling directly on top of it. And my friend, she's got hers sheltered up against, it's sort of like on a south facing wall, so it's getting the sun for the best part of the day, but it is protected a little bit from excess rainfall. And if you can site it somewhere equally between the garden, sort of the source of garden waste and the source of your kitchen waste, then you know you're making it a wee bit more accessible, and you will be more inclined to feed it more regularly. So once we've located where we want to have our compost bin and the container has been identified, there's 5 main ingredients that are required. First of all is the garden kitchen waste, which I've already mentioned a few times. So it's a mix of greens, what we talk about, grass, vegetable and fruit peelings, and browns, things like your twigs and newspapers. Second thing is the microorganisms. They're all there, they appear naturally in the soil where the compost is being made. But if you buy one of the plastic bins that I mentioned, they'll be fully enclosed in the bottom, so nothing can actually get from the soil that it's sitting on top of up into the plastic bin. So make sure and get a shovelful or a spadeful of border soil, and make sure there's a couple of worms in it, and put that into your compost bin as a kind of starter, and that will kickstart the necessary amount of microorganisms and bacteria that needs to start making the compost. So the bacteria and the worms, they will break down the green and brown materials that we've started to gather into a crumbly rich, humus rich garden compost. And of course, I've already said rain. Here in Scotland, we don't need to worry about it. It's not too far away, especially this time of the year, big black clouds rolling round about here at the moment. But in the off chance in the summertime, we have extended periods of really dry weather. A watering can and just give it a wee slush of water to keep things dampish wouldn't be a bad thing. Air, we need air. We need to incorporate air into the heap as well, and that helps speed up the waste breakdown process. There's a picture here showing a fork in a wooden slatted compost heap, and quite literally your more able client can jump in there, or your good selves, and give it a good fork over. And what I tend to do is every time I add something to my heap, I just jump in. It's quite, I jump in, that makes me sound like I'm a racehorse. I clamber in and I fork it over every time I do it, and it seems to do the job for me. And the last thing we need is heat. The waste material can only turn into compost where there is sufficient heat. The microorganisms need the heat for them to do their job also. And the bigger the heap, the higher the heat is in the centre. So forking over the whole time, you're constantly turning the warmer bits from the inside out and the outside in. Don't know if you ever watch any of those wildlife programs about penguins in the winter time, where you see them all taking turns on being on the outside, then they work their way in, and then the ones in the middle have to go on the outside and so on. So I always think about those penguins when I'm turning my compost heap over, to try and constantly get that heat sort of like spread out round about it all. So, compost recipe. We now know that we need browns and greens, and there are scientific ratios that exist for making commercial composts, but here in my own little humble garden laboratory, I keep things more simple. Basically, I add in equal lots of browns to greens. Now, I don't measure them. I don't go about weighing them or anything like that. I've done it for quite a wee while now. I just kind of do it by sight. But you could have bins, pails that you actually gather green things into, and a pail that you gather your brown things into, and you add a pail of greens and a pail of browns, and then you are measuring quite equally. But as I say, I don't get too hung up in that. I'm just trying to be fairly equal as I go along. I'm also ensuring that there's a continuous layering going on, so I don't add in like 3 loads of grass clippings followed by a tiny little amount of dead leaves that I've gathered up. I try to make it fairly even as I'm going along. So it's a little often is probably the best way to go about doing it. I've already mentioned adding in the earthworms. I'm forking over every time I add in a new quantity of greens or browns. Water if required, but as I say, generally speaking here in Scotland, that's not really a concern. In the winter months, cover with like an old piece of carpet if you've got one, or an old rug, and then that will help maintain a warmer temperature to keep the composting process, that sort of cooking process, taking place throughout our kind of colder months also. And the last thing we need to do is add thyme, and the recipe will work in beautifully. So the pictures here, this is my compost heap, these pictures are. So this is a top left is the last thing that I added on was some grass clippings. So that's the grass clippings all having turned brown and that kind of dried out manky way. And then I've added in a mixture of stuff here. That was a whole load of pruning that I was doing and some dead headings. So that's gone in top. And the last thing I've got here is when I cut my beech hedge, that was a whole dod of beech leaves going in on top of it, all getting forked in afterwards. So the waste material ingredients, the greens that I mentioned, your quick rotting greens that add the bulk of the nitrogen, and nitrogen is one of the 3 key plant foods that all plants require. So these quick rotting greens are added to the compost heap, and they also help the microorganisms to reproduce. And this cute little jaguar cub here on the left hand side that is chewing a twig is demonstrating the twigs, which is the browns, which are your drier materials. They're generally carbon rich, which provide energy for the microorganisms to keep on working, because as much as they're there and we don't pay them any attention, they still need to be looked after. And they create mass for the heat to build up, and they also trap air within their coarser structures, which helps with air circulation in the heap. So just some examples here of greens and browns. Your quick rotting greens include your grass clippings, your soft leafy plants, your dead bedding plants, like all the kind of like when you're deadheading the flowers, seaweed. If you can go down to the beach with a poly bag and just pick up some seaweed, now you are allowed to lift a bag of seaweed from the coastline. I think if you went in with a tractor and trailer and started to dredge it, the council would be on to you. But if there's some seaweed like sort of like on the, if you're girdling about with the dog in the rocks or something like that, pick yourself up some seaweed. It's amazing to put into your compost heap. Cooked vegetables and fruit scraps are also considered a green, and nettles are a fabulous thing to be putting into your compost heap because they are a natural activator, another way of kickstarting and speeding up the process of breaking all that material down into making your compost. Your slow to break down browns include your tougher woody prunings, dried leaves, ones that are all those crinkly way that you can scrunch up with your fingers. If you can get your hand onto old hay, not hay that the farmer has just made this year that is still very fresh and not damp because he's dry, but it's still too damp, if that makes sense. So old hay or old straw, or indeed if you can even get a couple of pailfuls of strawy manure from a neighbouring farm and add that into your compost heap, that is delightful. Wood shavings, if the source is known and you know that it's untreated, it's not been tannalised or anything like that. Scrunched up cardboard and black ink newspapers, that's your plain run-of-the-mill newspapers, not your glossy ones, and wood ash in sort of relatively small quantities. Kitchen and garden waste materials are a blend of the green and brown, and I think I've actually, oh yeah, so there's what this, this slide is demonstrating that there's some things out there that are a wee bit, they fall into the green category, they fall into the brown category, so they are sort of neutral. So just put them in as a bit of both if you feel like it. So your fine woody prunings, soft hedge clippings like this picture here showing this hedge being clipped. If you've got some soil that you've been digging out the border and you've got some soil left over, you didn't use it all to backfill your plant, fling that in your compost heap. That's not going to go to waste, that will be good. Spent potting compost, stable and farmyard manures that I've already mentioned, fruit skins and cores. Because the cores, that bit that we tend not to eat, that's a bit more structure-like, so that has got a wee bit of brown in it as well as the green. Your vegetable peelings, a wee bit of brown and green there, and things like tea leaves and coffee grounds are neutral as well. And if you've got any vegetarian pets, such as rabbits and hamsters, their hutch and cage bedding can be used also. But there are some items that must never be added into your compost heap. Things like diseased plant material, perennial weeds, that's the ones that's got like the big long tap roots or they spread for miles and miles. Do not put them in your compost heap, or you will just introduce them back into your garden over the next year and you will hate yourself. Waxy leaves like laurel leaves, unless you can cut them up into quite fine pieces, I would avoid putting them in because they take a long time to break down. Cat and dog waste is a definite no-no. Lawn clippings that have been treated with herbicide within the past 6 months, avoid putting that in also. Any uncooked meat and fish is a complete no-no. Cooking grease and oils. Glossy paper and plastic coated cardboards, they can't go in either. That plastic is bad, and the glossy paper, that how it's printed, that inky stuff isn't good either. Synthetic fibres, but if you get some wool, I've got a neighbouring farm, the farm here has sheep in neighbour my garden, so their wool gets caught up in my fence, so I just pull the wool off and I fling that in the compost heap. Things like metals and wires, we'll put them in, and any pressure treated woods and their sawdust are no-nos as well. So time goes on, we're adding lots of ingredients in, we're jumping in, we're giving it a turnover every so often, and when will it be ready to use? It will be ready to be used at least 6 months, but more realistically 9 to 12 months is what I would say mine normally takes. I think this image is a really good image of homemade compost. It is perfect. The compost should be crumbly, brown and damp, but not wet. You can't wring it out like a cloth. You feel it and you know it's damp, but it's not wet. And if you have some parts that are not fully broken down, you can actually still see that they were a leaf at one time. Fling them back in and they can be recomposted or have a second heap ready to go, and you can put the uncomposted, the unbroken down parts into your second compost heap. Problems with your compost heap. Really you shouldn't have any if you're adding items in equal layers and you're adding a wee bit of water if need be. But if there is a bad smell, it's probably caused by too much nitrogen, and that's maybe because there's too much green in it, so add more browns such as straw or some torn up cardboard. If bad smell can also be caused by compaction, so get in a wee bit more regularly and turn it over with your fork. And bad smell, also overwatering, so again more browns will help sort of like counteract that. If it's not heating up, and that sounds daft, how are you going to find out if it's not heating up? Well, I went into my compost heap to get a little bit of compost to show you later on, and I kind of like dug down with my fork and then I put my hand trowel in. And it was warm in there, not roasting hot that I could boil an egg or something, but you know, a definite heat coming off of it. So if it's not heating up, it's lack of nitrogen that's in there, so it needs extra greens. Perhaps lack of oxygen, again, turn over the contents with a fork. Or perhaps the compost is actually ready, and the ready compost smells earthy. It smells like walking through a woodland rather than warm mould, and like the previous picture, it looks dark brown and crumbly. And if the compost is damp and only the very centre is warm, then perhaps the heap is too small. You can actually have too small a heap in a big volume, like if you're working in a compost bin, they really should be filled up and allowed to make with like a big volume like that to fill the actual container that's allowed for it. So, using compost in the garden. You can use the compost as your own potting compost for sowing seeds and things like that. You can mix equal parts with sifted garden compost along with topsoil and some sharp sand or grit or perlite. You can use it as a soil conditioner, fork on about a 5 centimetre deep layer of your homemade compost onto the garden borders, and the compost, the natural food that has built up in there will slowly release itself over the coming months. As a mulch to prevent some weeds from growing and to trap moisture in the soil layer below, lay 10 centimetres of compost as a surface mulch. And if you are looking to improve your soil structure and texture, you've got to dig it in. As much as the wee worms will start pulling some of the garden compost down through the soil when they're burrowing away, you've really got to dig it in. So digging garden compost into a sandy soil will help the light grainy soil retain moisture and nutrients, and digging the garden compost into a heavy clay soil will break it up, break up that compacted soil, creating air and drainage channels, which will prevent waterlogging and preventing far better root growing conditions. So there is a little video here that I'm not going to show because it's about 8 minutes long, but Jenny will put the link into the chat later on for you if you fancy having a wee look at it. It's Dr. Jenny Yee, and she shows how to make her own compost at home using pails. And I just think it's a great inspirational video. So if you get the chance, please go and have a look at that. Heap, quite the thing. Now, making a big compost heap like that might not be everybody's bag. So I've got one other little thing that I want to show you, Jenny. If I can find my video that I want to show, it is our mini composter. It's a really wee short video, so I'm just going to play it, and this might inspire you to have a little go.
Okay.
Welcome to the Trellis Windowsill composter. This is a really simple to do, fun way of learning how to recycle and compost garden and kitchen waste that can be made into a new compost that can be used to grow more food and flowers next year. So what do we need? Recycle a large plastic juice bottle, grab some scissors or a knife, a nail or sharp pin, and a spray water bottle, along with a handful each of shredded paper or card, some garden soil, some small twigs, and a handful of dead leaves. Gather some composting ingredients from the garden and the kitchen: grass clippings, fruit and vegetable scraps, dead flowers when deadheading, tea bags, eggshells, the list goes on. So, start off by cutting the top 5 centimetres off the top of the plastic bottle. And using this pin or nail, carefully pierce 15 to 20 holes around the base and sides of the bottle. Place a scoopful of garden soil, shredded card and old leaves into the bottom of the bottle. Spray this with a little water. Then add a handful of small twigs on top to allow air to circulate from the base of the bottle. Then start layering the compost ingredients, crushing and shredding them with your fingers as you go. Place the upturned bottle lid inside the cut juice bottle. This will act as a funnel to spray a little water into, every few days to keep the compost materials damp preferably. Cover the top with a sheet of kitchen roll in between times. Place the bottle onto a tray and sit on a bright windowsill. This heat will help with the composting process. Use a long-handled wooden spoon to occasionally stir the compost bottle to further aid air circulation. And always have a wee look-see. The compost materials will quickly start to break down, turning into a dark-coloured damp dod. And of course, keep collecting more compost ingredients, especially when out and about, perhaps deadheading plants. And keep topping up the bottles with the new ingredients. As the materials compost and decay, they will shrink in volume also. And remember to give a wee stir every so often to incorporate more air. And the materials will soon break down and morph into a crumbly, damp, soil-like material, your own homemade garden compost. Store it and use it in spring to top dress patio pots and garden borders as a slow release feed for plants. And little things this year might well lead to bigger things next year. This windowsill composting activity can be used to engage in learning about food waste and recycling, encourage light exercise gathering garden composting ingredients, and maintaining dexterity and fine motor movement, and of course, the satisfaction and reward in making a product that can be used to grow more plants next season. Go on, have a go yourself. And there we have it, Jenny. I'm just very quickly, I see what the time is. God.
Brilliant.
So I just wanted to show you, this is the composter, the mini composter. Now I have filled this up several times to the top, and you can see how much it reduces in volume when it all starts to break down. So I've topped this up 2 times since that video was made, and you can see, as I say, it's sort of like halfway down, and I'm giving it a good stir every so often. And I'm amazed by how many worms are actually in there. So obviously the little scoopful of soil that I started off as my compost starter had some baby worms in it, because I definitely didn't see any, and they have grown into being bigger worms. And lastly, Jenny, I just want to show you, this is from my compost.
Whoa,
heap.
fabulous. Yeah.
Now this isn't ready yet.
Okay, I can see it's got some big bits in it.
But you can see, you know, it's going the right colour. Doesn't smell, it just smells of the earth. You know, it smells nice actually. I wouldn't be having my nose beside it if I didn't like the smell of it. So yeah, it definitely works. But anyway, I'll stop talking now.
Fabulous, Joan. That is just such a tour de force, and absolutely crammed full of information about composting. And I'm aiming for the tractor sized one, you know. That's
good.
Tractor sized heap I would like.
Aim high, absolutely.
That's it. But I might start off with the one on the windowsill just for a bit of fun. That'll be good. So we've had quite a few questions come in over the time, so we'll have a little look. I'm just going to ask everybody if we can go on to maybe speaker view. I think that might be better if I go to the gallery and just go to speaker view and let people see us when we're asking the questions. So where shall we start? Margaret was saying that, well, first of all, we had a great quote actually from Malcolm talking about microbes. He said there's more microbes in a teaspoon of soil than people on the planet, which I thought,
oh wow,
interesting. I'm
going to keep that one. Thank you, Malcolm.
Keep that one.
You're welcome. I've got lots of geeky kind of soil quotes like that I've collected over the years. So.
Right, I know, but that's great, and it's things like that that it really kind of like drives it home how important this subject is, and we know so little about it, or the general public knows so little about it. We just take things for granted, and these little beasties are so important to our very existence, and we don't give them any notice whatsoever. Cheers.
Brilliant. Okay, Margaret was saying she's got a black bin composter, and she says it heats up very quickly in the sunshine. Should she leave the lid off so it doesn't cook too much? Is there a sort of balance there, or can you just safely leave it, do you think?
No, I would just let it. If it's cooking quickly, then get on with it. My friends actually had a proper composter, one that they plugged into the wall, and like they thought they produced enough garden waste that this would work for them, but they didn't produce enough garden waste to make it wasn't viable to use. But they could get compost in like 24 hours out of this thing. So if Margaret can make quick compost, then bag it and share it.
Okay, great. James has just posted something. Have a look at Thermo King compost bins, with or without a base, from recycled plastic. He's giving them a bit of a
Thermo King. I'll have a wee look at them. Thank you.
A thumbs up there. Lorna was saying she cuts the bottom out of her plastic bins to sit them directly on the ground, so that you don't have to have them separated from the ground, which is a good idea. And someone else was saying it's quite difficult to turn compost in these kind of bins. Have we got any tips on that? Tips on it?
You can buy tumbling compost bins.
Okay.
They're a wee bit more expensive. Maybe this Thermo King website will have an example. You get tumbling ones, so basically it's like your Dalek one on the side, and it's like a spit roast, and it's got a kind of handle, and you turn it like so. They can be quite heavy to do so, but that's one way of not having to jump in and turn over a wooden slatted one, or as you say, the Dalek shaped ones are quite difficult. It's okay when it's maybe only about a third full, you can get your fork in and turned around a bit, but when it gets up a bit, you can't get the leverage in.
Yeah, tricky. I know I've had trouble with one before, and I made the mistake of actually lifting off the bin.
Oh,
It all just fell apart. There was compost at the bottom. I managed to salvage that, and I just put it all back in again.
yeah.
But yeah, they're quite tricky. Oh, Rebecca was asking, is there anything else you can use instead of old carpet? And nobody's come up with any other suggestions. I wondered if you had anything there.
Oh, a bit of tarpaulin, maybe. If well, you can buy tarpaulin off the internet, but I'm sure if you kept your eye open, somebody in your street, or go down, if you live by the seaside, go down to the boatyard and there'll be old bits of tarpaulin lying about. You could do your bit and tidy up for them. So something like an old bit of tarpaulin, or even just like a big plastic sheet, a kind of like thick bit of plastic sheeting. You could probably get a length of that from somewhere like B&Q, somewhere like that. And that would work as well. That would trap, the plastic would trap some of the heat down like that. Or maybe something like, even just something like, oh gosh, if you went into the charity shop, you might get like a big bedspread or a big quilt, something like that, that would, eventually it would get wet, wouldn't it? But it would do that job of like that layer of insulation.
Yeah, sure. I'm just thinking you can maybe recycle packaging like that. Stuff that you pop between your fingers and all that.
Oh yeah, the bubble wrap.
Yeah, that might do it as well. Cool. Now here's some questions about things that you maybe or maybe not want to put in your bin. What's your take on rhubarb leaves? Can you put them in?
Rhubarb leaves can be composted, yes. They are not, they're poisonous for us to eat, and they're very poisonous to hens, but by the time they've gone into the compost heap and done that whole broken downness, that's okay.
That's okay. And what about sort of acidic things like lemons and oranges? And
they can go in as well, but you'll find they take forever to break down. Cut them up into, if you watch Dr. Jenny's video, she obviously drinks a lot of gin because she's got lots of lemons, and you see her cutting them up. So yes, you can put them in. I understand the question, you know, like the thinking about the acidity. There's not, you would have to be putting in barrel loads of lemons to affect the acidity.
That's brilliant. And there was a question there about rats and how to avoid them. Monty touched on it, but
don't have any dairy products, don't have any meat of any sort, like definitely not raw meat or raw fish, and I don't put any leftover meat products into either, because well, here it's foxes that I would attract to my compost heap if I did that, and rats are so attracted as well, so put in things that rats do not want to eat. Some people don't put things like bread in either because they believe that the bread attracts rats. If it's one of the shop bought ones where it's fully enclosed, the rats can't get into it, but if it's an open one like my pallet compost heap, then rats could go in there. But avoid putting in things that rats want to eat.
Okay, great. I think we've just about covered all the questions. I'm just going to have a little look. There was quite a bit of discussion about tea bags. Make sure you don't have plastic tea bags or tear open your tea bags if you're putting them in there.
Yeah.
And yes, I'm going to put my coffee grounds in as well. And nettles. I didn't know that about nettles. That was interesting.
Yeah. They're a natural activator, so they're very good. Again, I've got a farmer's field right beside me here, and there's a big clump of nettles grow in the corner where he doesn't come in and mow with his machinery. So it's great. So I think that's great. There's all that natural stuff growing in the corner of that field. I just jump in every so often, cut some nettles and fling them in my compost heap.
That's great. Anna's asking, did Monty say that once you've turned once, don't add any more stuff to your heap?
What he was saying was, what he's done was he's filled the first heap up, and then he turned it by putting it into the second bin. He then doesn't add anything else on there because that is a different stage of composting. So that first heap that was turned into, he said he would use as a mulch because it hadn't fully broken down, to use as like for sowing seeds or anything like that into. But he inferred that he was going to turn it into the next one and turn it into the next one again. So that was going to be 4 tons it was going to get, but he never adds any new material once it started its turning process. All the new stuff is going into that first bay.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's grand. And someone else is asking, was it